Chris Gardner discusses the variability in weight loss using different diets.
Nutrients are different, but people are different too. Not all the overweight people are the same. There's a huge amount of variability in people who have more weight than their neighbor. Okay, so let me show you an interesting finding that we've looked at in our data. So here's Tracy McLaughlin's data where they have a really fancy test to see among overweight people who's close to being diabetic, who's insulin resistant, and who isn't. So this is a group of people that are all pretty heavy. A body mass index of 30 to 35 is first stage obesity. They've got 30 to 50 pounds to lose, okay? So it's a fairly tight range. It's not 10 pounds to 100 pounds to lose. And then they do this fancy test called steady state plasma glucose, which they have to hook you up to a bunch of IVs for 8 hours and do some incredible things to you. But they figure out whose insulin works really well and whose doesn't at roughly the same level of fat. And then they split them into tertiles. Who's the most insulin sensitive? Who's the most insulin resistant? This is close to diabetes. And who's in the middle? And then they look at their blood pressure and their triglycerides and their HDL and their glucose. And the point of this paper was to say, in roughly the same weight range, you can get a 4, 6, 3, or 4-fold difference in some classic risk factors, even though you're pretty much the same level of overweight, depending on how insulin resistant you are. So this is a really hot topic right now. Here's a study that just got published in the Journal of the American Medical Association, I think last summer or so. So here's somebody who didn't do as well as we did, but they did an admirable job. They got all of 73 people, and they put them on a low glycemic load diet. That's a low-carb diet. Or they put them on a low-fat diet, and I put the proportions up there so you could see. And they did 18 months, which is really admirable. That's far longer. That's longer than our study. That's pretty much the longest study I know of so far. These were young adults who were overweight, and they lost some, but they pretty much lost exactly the same amount of weight, according to this. Now, they actually broke their results up after they were all done and looked at it a different way. They looked at who in the beginning was more or less insulin resistant. They did a simple oral glucose tolerance test, which means you give them 75 grams of glucose in their mouth, sorry, not their arm, in their mouth. And then you take blood samples for a couple hours, and you see how much their insulin responds. And they took the 30-minute time point in that test, and they said, OK, who's at the low end of below the median for this insulin concentration? They only had 15 and 13 people who had it. And it really wasn't any different than the full group. Those were the insulin-sensitive folks, because their insulin didn't have to go up very much to put the glucose away. But the other half, they called insulin-resistant because they were above this level. And these were dramatically different results, which were getting diluted in the whole study. You can't see it over there. You can't see it till you break them up. So I thought that was really intriguing. And as I read their paper, I saw them cite a couple other people. And these are kind of some odd studies, but let me show you these. So these are not big studies. There's 5 people, 4, 6, and 6. But they came up with their own criteria. Nobody agrees what they are. They called insulin-sensitive people fasting insulin below 10 and insulin-resistant fasting insulin above 15. So their conclusion was the insulin-sensitive people on a high carb versus a low carb, they actually did a little better on the high carb, but the insulin-resistant people did just the opposite. They did better on the low carb. So it may be who you are or your characteristics predisposes you to see how well you're going to do. There's another study. This is going to look almost identical. It's like I didn't change slides, but it's a completely separate study. There's 8 in each group. They had yet another way of picking who was insulin sensitive and who was insulin resistant. They called it a high glycemic load and a low glycemic load diet, but it's the same thing. It's a high carb and a low carb diet. And they saw the same thing. They saw this reversal of effect. So the insulin-resistant folks did better. Again, they fed them all their food, this time for 6 months. OK, so we thought, hey, we got that data. We have people who did that. We have Atkins versus Ornish, and we have some measures where we could figure this out. And we had 4 different measures, and they all looked the same, so I'm only going to show you one. We picked fasting insulin tertiles. We split them into thirds. So this is the group who was the most insulin sensitive, and this is the most insulin resistant. We actually have more people than those other studies, even though it's just a little subset of our study, right? So if you were insulin sensitive and you're on Ornish versus Atkins, it's actually a much smaller difference than we saw in the whole study. But if you were insulin resistant, it was actually a much bigger difference than we saw in the whole study. So on the one hand, we exaggerated, and on the other hand, we underestimated. So it may be that insulin resistance predisposes you to being more successful on a low carbohydrate diet, which is a little bit intuitively appealing. If you're insulin resistant, you have a hard time putting away your glucose. So you go on the national diet that says low fat, high carb, and they're just pumping carbohydrates into you, and you have a hard time with that. So maybe there's good reason to believe that the insulin resistant people would be like this. Now, how unique is this? Is this just 1 or 2 people out of 100? No, this is the top third of our study. And the other studies I showed you split people at the median, half above and half below, all the people in their study. So this isn't something that's unique. This isn't something where you have to be really out of whack to see this happen. This is a pretty large proportion of the overweight population in the US that something may be going on here. These are all the individual weight loss by person, by diet. Look how many people lost and kept off 30 pounds after a whole year. You can take off 30 pounds and keep it off after a year on any diet. It's probably more an issue of adherence than diet. I mean, there are more people in Atkins who lost and kept off 30 pounds than the other groups. And look how many people gained weight. They gained weight on all 4 diets too. So that's something to keep out there. Keep in mind.